Can Barack Obama fulfill his pledge to close Guantanamo before he leaves office? I'll ask the man who drafted that pledge, former White House lawyer Gregory Craig. I'm Mehdi Hassan, also on the show. More than 40 years after the US declared a war on drugs, laws around the world are changing. Mexico could soon legalize marijuana, and Ireland is planning to decriminalize the use of heroin, cocaine, and cannabis. Is it time to end the drug war? That's our debate. But first, as US President Barack Obama's one-time top lawyer, Gregory Craig drafted the executive order to shut down the prison camp at Guantanamo Bay. He ended up resigning, but Guantanamo is still open. And just this week, Congress passed a bill banning the transfer of its detainees to the US. So, will President Obama deliver on his campaign promise and close Gitmo for good? Our headliner, former White House counsel Gregory Craig. Gregory Craig, thanks for joining me on UpFront. You drafted the executive order which your then boss, Barack Obama, issued on his, I think, third day in office as president, announcing the shutdown of Guantanamo Bay by the 22nd of January 2010. We're now coming up to the 6th anniversary of that date. We believe President Obama is about to announce a plan to shut down Guantanamo Bay and go around the Congress. But how embarrassed are you? How ashamed are you that it's taken this long, that 6 years after the date, something you described rightly as a blight on American values and national security is still open?
Well, no one thought that it would be this difficult, to be quite honest. When the president was elected in 2008, the incumbent president, President Bush, supported closing the detention center in Guantanamo. President Obama's opponent in the campaign, 2008, Senator McCain, supported closing Guantanamo. And at the time he signed those executive orders, he thought that this was something that, in fact, would have no kind of political difficulties getting through. But thereafter, during 2009, 2010, it became a political issue, a partisan political issue. And the difficulties we've had closing Guantanamo are attributable to the fact that there are people in Congress that object to closing Guantanamo and have created obstacles to doing so.
You co-wrote a Washington Post op-ed last week, which was headlined, "The President Doesn't Need Congress's Permission to Close Guantanamo." Briefly explain to our viewers how you think Obama could bypass Congress and shut it down when the new Republican House Speaker, Paul Ryan, says the President doesn't have the authority to do that, he says, and the President himself has agreed to sign a new defense bill just this week banning the transfer of Guantanamo prisoners to the US mainland.
Well, with respect, I disagree with the Speaker of the House on his understanding of the Constitution. There are two arguments here, Mehdi. The first argument is that under Section 2, Article 2 of the Constitution, the President is the Commander-in-Chief of the military in the United States of America. Part of that authority, we believe, is his ability to designate locations where law of war detainees or prisoners of war are held. And so we believe it's well within, smack dab in the core of his responsibilities and his authority as Commander-in-Chief to be able to say, I want to move for reasons related to our war objectives, and because of expense, it's terribly expensive, I want to move this detainee from this military facility to another military facility. And the second part of the argument is that the Congress of the United States, if it passes legislation that attempts to prohibit or interfere or limit his capacity as Commander-in-Chief to make these dispositions, those laws are unconstitutional.
If what you say is correct, and the President wants to shut down Guantanamo, has always wanted to shut down Guantanamo, and if he has the power under the Constitution as Commander-in-Chief to do it, to go around Paul Ryan and the other Republicans in Congress, then why hasn't he done it already? Why have we been waiting 6 years? Why didn't he do it on day 3?
He has always wanted to work with Congress on this, and he's always tried to work with Congress. What he has been focusing on, I think, over the last 6 or 7 years is to make sure that the evidence with respect to each and every detainee is understood as to their involvement in terrorism activities, that those who are, there are 3 buckets of people there. There's people who will be prosecuted for crimes. There will be people who will be discharged and have been identified as transferable. And there's a third bucket that falls in the category of law of war detainees that were neither going to be transferred or tried. So I think he's focused his attempt to close Guantanamo on transferring people that are eligible for transfer, trying the people that are being tried, and bringing back into the United States those people that should be housed in the United States. And the Congress at every point has objected. And he's still trying, Mehdi. He's still trying, actually, to work with Congress.
But if you're one of the 53 people at Guantanamo Bay out of the 112 remaining there who've been cleared for release, you might think to yourself, well, Gregory Craig, a man who knows the law, worked for President Obama, saying he could shut it down any time without Paul Ryan's permission. And yet here I am, stuck in limbo in this god-awful place. Why? Why not just do it yesterday?
There are certain security concerns that they have on the transferability, as well as...
Well, not the 53 who've been cleared for release.
No, the 53 are not just free to send back to any place, because they will not be sent back to a place where they would be tortured or where they'd be mistreated or where they would experience themselves additional hardship. Yep. And we will not send them to places where we don't have some assurance that they will not engage in terrorist activities again. So there's a security concern there that exists with the 53. But you're right in pointing out that those 53 should be returned or transferred as promptly as is possible. They're mostly Yemenis at this point, as promptly as is possible, and that we're really talking about 59, the balance. 10 people who are in the they're going to be prosecuted bucket, and 49 people that are in
to go back to my question, just to be clear, yes or no, he could have shut it down theoretically under the law in 2012, 2013?
I believe he could have.
9 prisoners have died in custody at Guantanamo, and human rights abuses have been well documented by the FBI and others. Some of the worst of these abuses have happened on President Obama's watch. The very painful force-feeding of shackled prisoners, for example, which the International Red Cross has called a form of torture. Is that something you argued against when you were part of the administration? And if so, do you think Obama officials, former colleagues of yours, should be held accountable in a court of law for some of the stuff that went on in Guantanamo?
The security arrangements inside of Guantanamo were the responsibility of the military to the extent that they totally complied with the Geneva Conventions. And our concern was that everything that was done inside of Guantanamo on President Obama's watch fully complied with the American laws and the international obligations. And I believe that they did. There's no doubt
Even
whatsoever.
when UN organizations, the Red Cross, as others say, that when you take a prisoner with a 6-member riot squad, strap him to the ground, force tubes up his nose, extreme pain, they call that a form of torture. You don't think that's anything
I think this is part of saving their lives, because they were involved in a hunger strike that would have caused them to lose their lives. And I think lawyers would not agree with that analysis.
So you don't think any human rights abuses in Guantanamo happened on President Obama's watch, despite what various groups and observers have said over the last few years?
Well, I don't think many groups and observers have found lots of human rights abuse in Guantanamo.
Well, they haven't been allowed to. The Obama administration, for example, refused to allow the OSCE to even come to Guantanamo and investigate. A lot of groups have been thwarted in trying to find out what's happening on the ground.
Well, I don't believe that force feeding is a human rights violation. It's unpleasant, it's unattractive. We don't want to have to do that.
Let's say President Obama doesn't close the Guantanamo prison, isn't able to do it by the end of his term, despite the legal powers you say he has. There's not much chance of a President Hillary Clinton shutting it down, is there? We know she's more of a hawk than Obama. We know from her email leaks that she's made jokes about Guantanamo prisoners. She hasn't been outspoken on this issue. Whether we get President Hillary Clinton or President Jeb Bush, we might be stuck with Guantanamo for a long time going forward if Obama doesn't do it now.
I just disagree with that. I think that there is a national consensus, and Secretary Clinton is part of that consensus, that Guantanamo today does more damage to the national interest, the national image, than it does good. And so, by the way, when she was Secretary of State, she was very vigorous in all the efforts that she was responsible for in trying to close down Guantanamo, and she supported all the efforts that the president made.
Would you call for her to make that pledge now as a presidential candidate that she will shut, as Obama did, because she hasn't made it so far as a presidential candidate?
I think she fully supports, I mean, I doubt that this is a problem for her. She fully supports closing Guantanamo, as do, may I say, most Democrats. This is a surprise.
You say national consensus. The sad truth is the American public aren't with you on this. In 2014, Gallup found that 66% of Americans are against closing Guantanamo Bay. That's the problem that politicians have. They don't want to go against a fearful public.
If the President of the United States took a leadership position, decided it was in the national security interest, and as Commander-in-Chief to advance our objectives in the war against terror, he would have the support of the American people in closing Guantanamo. I think he has the right to do it, and he should do it.
But it's been a failure of leadership.
I would not say it's a failure of leadership.
You said if he exercises leadership, therefore he hasn't exercised it so far on this issue.
He has pursued it in other ways, Mehdi. He's tried to work with the Congress, and that's not been successful.
And do you think he should issue an apology to the people in Guantanamo Bay who've been held there without trial, who turned out not to be terrorists? The man who was 89 years old, for example, the teenagers. Should there be an apology?
I think there's no need for the President of the United States to apologize to anyone. They know what his position has been and what he's been trying to do.
Don't think you should apologize to people you've held without charge who turned out to be completely innocent? No need for an apology.
Well, he worked very hard from the very first day.
Doesn't really help you.
No,
if I've been stuck in Guantanamo, the president working hard doesn't help me.
Well, he didn't put them there. The Uyghurs.
But he didn't shut it down, which you say he could have done any time. We discussed it. He said to me he could have done it in 2012, could have done it in 2013. Therefore, it's on him.
He tried to work with the Congress of the United States to do it, and I am uncritical of him and his efforts. He worked very hard to do so.
Gregory Craig, thanks for joining me on UpFront. Something that can be quite frustrating is the rather inconsistent way in which the terrorist label is applied in the United States.
We will hunt down terrorists who threaten our country wherever they are.
So let's play a game. I'm sure you're all familiar with Dylan Roof, a white supremacist who allegedly tried to start a race war by killing 9 black Americans in a church in Charleston. But he wasn't labeled as a terrorist by the mainstream media or by the FBI. Pakistani-American Jubair Ahmed, on the other hand, was sentenced to 12 years in prison in 2012 for making a YouTube video on behalf of the Pakistani militant group Lashkar-e-Taiba. 9 people killed versus YouTube video. Okay, what about Jared Loughner, the man who in 2011 shot Arizona Congresswoman Gabby Giffords and killed 6 other people? Here is an anti-government activist who tried to kill a congresswoman, but he's not a terrorist apparently. He was charged only with murder and attempted murder. Compare and contrast with Javed Iqbal, a New York businessman sentenced to 6 years in prison for assisting terrorists. What did he do? He provided Americans with access to Hezbollah's satellite channel. Well, if that's terrorism, then Robert Doggett, the man who allegedly plotted to attack an entire Muslim community in New York, must surely have been labeled a terrorist. Not quite. He ended up charged with solicitation to commit a civil rights violation by intending to damage or destroy religious property. He's currently at home awaiting trial. No mention of the T word. Yet here's Tariq Mahanna, a pharmacist who was sentenced to more than 17 years in prison for providing material support to terrorists, for essentially translating Al-Qaeda propaganda videos. Some might say that falls under freedom of speech. So is there a double standard? Not if you're Fox News.
Not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslim.
But hold on, a recent study found that since 9/11, far-right extremists have killed almost twice as many Americans in the US as Muslim extremists. So to sum up, if you're a Muslim American and worried about the T word, be careful when you're going online, visiting YouTube or watching cable, and don't even think about taking a clock to school. If you're a white supremacist, do whatever you like. What is going on in the world of drug laws? In Mexico, the Supreme Court has opened the door to legalizing marijuana, while in Ireland there's a radical new plan to decriminalize the use of marijuana, heroin and cocaine. But perhaps most surprisingly, last month the United States government announced the early release from prison of 6,000 non-violent drug offenders. So, more than 4 decades after US President Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs, is it finally time for a new approach? To debate this, I'm joined by the British journalist Johann Hari, author of a best-selling book on the drug war called Chasing the Scream, and from Salt Lake City, Utah, Ernest Istook, a former Republican congressman who sat on the Homeland Security Committee. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me in the arena. Johann, the subtitle of your book refers to the last days of the war on drugs. Given the recent announcements in Ireland, in Mexico, here in the US too, are we living through those last days right now in your view?
It totally depends on what we do now. It's now 100 years since we first banned drugs, and the reason why I wanted to look into this is because one of my earliest memories was of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And as I got older, I realised we had drug addiction in my family, and I wanted to figure out what would genuinely reduce the problems caused by drugs and the problems associated with it. So I went to the places that have fought the drug war hardest, and I went to the places that have fully decriminalised or legalised drugs, and the difference was really striking. The places that are fighting the drug war hard have worse and worse problems, and every year they get worse. And the places that have decriminalised and legalised are seeing those problems really significantly diminish. We've got to look at the real world at some point.
Ernest, this took Portugal, Holland, Switzerland, they've all decriminalised marijuana use. Ireland and Mexico look like they're about to follow them. Uruguay's legalised it. Here in the United States, 20 states have legalised it for medical use, 4 states for recreational use. Do you feel you've been left behind by events, that your kind of war on drugs perspective is now a minority perspective?
No, I'm not about to surrender my judgment to Mr. Hare's personal opinions or his anecdotal observations. Nationally, the 2 most prevalent drugs, the illegal drugs, and of course alcohol, combined have about a $500 billion negative impact on the United States economy. And it's pretty well equally split between alcohol and illegal drugs. We have 500,000 people going to emergency rooms here in the USA each year because of the impact of their marijuana use.
So why do you think...
We have families that find people can't hold a job properly. They don't provide the nurturing for their children because they spend too much time getting high.
So why do you think there is this trend now across many parts of the world, including in the US, towards decriminalisation and liberalisation? Isn't that because informed people are saying the current setup doesn't work?
No, it's because people are not being well informed. We have a media, especially here in the USA, that tends to go toward the liberalizing of things, especially when it comes to personal behaviors, the decline in focus on self-responsibility, the elevation by the media of saying, oh, the notion of being free is being able to do things and not worry about the negative impact that it has on your family and society. Just look at the studies that have come out in the last year about the permanent brain damage that's caused by adolescent use, and that's up to age 25 of marijuana.
Congressman Istuk is totally right.
The negative impacts are rarely reported.
Congressman Istuk is absolutely right that addiction is something that doesn't just affect the individual, it affects the whole family. I've seen that in my own life. That's precisely why we have to choose policies that genuinely reduce addiction as opposed to policies that increase them. Let's look at, you see, if we talk about it in the abstract, you can say any old rubbish and it'll sound plausible. Let's talk about a real place. Portugal in the year 2000 had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin. And every year they tried Congressman Istuk's method more and more. They arrested more people, they imprisoned more people, and every year the problem got worse until finally they got a panel of scientists and doctors to look at the best evidence. And the panel came back and said, decriminalise all drugs from cannabis to crack, but, and this is the crucial next step, take all the money we currently spend on making users and addicts' lives worse and spend it instead on turning their lives around.
I don't think that's an adequate description of what Portugal is doing.
Just to give you the results, it's been 15 years. The results are very clear. Injecting drug use is down in Portugal by 50%.
You misdescribe what Portugal is doing.
50%. You know, I went and interviewed a man called João Figueira. He was the top drug cop in Portugal. He said everything Congressman Istuk said when they did the decriminalisation. And when I met him, he said everything I said would happen didn't happen.
No, don't tell me that person singled me out by name. No, he doesn't know what I think.
He was talking about the broader arguments that you're
If you look at the so-called war on drugs in the United States, right now, the largest single expenditure is on treatment. At the federal level, it's something like $10 billion a year. 40% of these numbers come from the White House. From the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy.
Which is not a
40% of the money we spend on drug war in the United States is on treatment. $10 billion, okay? So we are going with that. Now, you misdescribe what Portugal is doing. Portugal has not legalized the use of drugs.
I said decriminalized. I said decriminalized.
And in fact,
have you ever been to Portugal, Congressman?
Here's a question for you, Johan. You talk about that crime will come down, that we'll be able to solve some of the criminal problems around drugs if we decriminalize or in cases legalize. Isn't that a kind of utopian view in the sense that a lot of these cartels now, they make a lot of their money from people smuggling, from illegal mining, from organ trafficking. I mean, criminals are not going to stop being criminals simply because you take drugs out of the sphere of illegality, are they?
Oh, sure. If you took the iPhone away from Apple, Apple wouldn't go bankrupt, but it would lose a huge share of its business. You've got to understand the dynamic that's happening here. If you imagine, if we stepped out of here now and we decided to steal a bottle of vodka, and that store caught us, they'd call the cops would take us away. That store doesn't need to be violent, it doesn't need to be intimidating. If we tried to steal a bag of cannabis or a bag of cocaine, obviously the guy selling that can't ring the police would arrest him. He has to fight us. In fact, he has to establish his place in that neighborhood through violence and intimidation. The
totally
war on drugs creates a war for drugs.
I don't know what you're saying has any relevance to the huge national problem here in the U.S.
I'll explain to you.
With
I'll explain
illegal
to you
drugs
the relevance. I understand why you don't
society,
understand
costing families about $250 billion a year. When children aren't nurtured, when you keep going this cycle, this interrelationship between poverty and drug use.
I'm not going to take lectures. I'm not going to take lectures
when
on
somebody has
addiction
brain
and a
damage.
family with addiction.
Well, I'm not going to take lectures from you, sir.
Look at what happened at the end of alcohol prohibition, right? When the drug is banned, it's transferred to armed criminal gangs. They go to war to control it. Today, does the head of Heineken go and shoot the head of Smirnoff in the face? Of course not. Nothing has changed about the drug. Alcohol's the same drug it always was. This causes an enormous amount of violence. Mexico, I spent a lot of time in Mexico researching for my book. The catastrophe there caused entirely by this policy.
You make it sound like the more drugs we legalize, the better off we're going to be.
Yeah, that's in fact what I think.
Is there a danger that you're a little bit too relaxed about the upsides of legalization, decriminalization, and turning a blind eye to what will be downsides? I mean, The Guardian, a liberal left newspaper, when they reviewed your book, they said to you, the ubiquitous, irredeemable misery raked by the savage entwinement of abject poverty and drug use. It's not always positive, is it?
I don't think he could have read my book, because there's about 3 chapters about that whole question. We've got to... the tragedies caused by drug abuse are things that I've seen play out in my own life. There's absolutely no dispute about that. The question is, do we spend the money we have punishing, shaming, stigmatizing those users and making their lives worse, in which case their addiction gets worse, because addiction is caused by the pain in your heart and isolation.
Worse?
Or do we spend that money on making their lives significantly better? When Portugal did that, when they invested that money in a huge job creation program. Do you want people who are in poverty to spend
all their time getting high rather than getting out of poverty?
No.
Is that what you're proposing?
No.
So
anyone who's read anything I've ever said knows that's the opposite.
By drugs.
Have you ever heard the phrase straw man? Have you ever heard the phrase straw man?
You want to...
Ernest, you mentioned... Hold on, Johan, Johan, hold on. Ernest, you mentioned poverty and the impact on families and communities. One of the major reasons, especially in the United States, that people are very critical of the drug war is they see it as being racist. They see that certain communities are being disproportionately targeted. Surely you, as a former legislator, must recognize that there is this huge imbalance in terms of arrests, prosecutions between white drug users and black drug users. That is part of the backdrop of this war on drugs.
The imbalance, 1, exists, but 2, it's based upon behavior, not being based upon prejudice.
So when black people are 4 times more likely than white people, when black people are nearly 4 times more likely than white people to be arrested on charges of marijuana possession, according to the ACLU, despite data suggesting they use the drug at the same rate, is that not racist?
Well, again, I'm not going to adopt the ACLU. I'd rather look at the Justice Department numbers that show that disparity is based upon behavior, not upon prejudice.
We can hear how grotesque this is.
Disparity in the rates of use. That's
the data from Human Rights Watch suggests otherwise. Johan, do you believe the drug war is fundamentally... I mean, where does race play a role in view when you've come up as a critic?
It's not about my opinion or Congressman Istuk's position. I spoke to lots of police officers who would talk about how they would only ever go to African-American neighborhoods to do drug busts. One of the people, actually not someone I spoke to, but someone who's spoken elsewhere, a guy called Matthew Fogg, went to his boss one day and said, "Hey boss, how come we only ever go to black neighborhoods to bust people? I'm pretty sure white people use drugs as well." And his boss said something like, "Yeah, you're right, but white people get lawyers, they know judges, they know journalists. We'll just go for the low-hanging fruit." The effect is overwhelmingly racist.
Well, I hope you've reported that individual by name and jurisdiction so somebody can do something about it, rather than you just give an anonymous anecdotal quote.
It's not anonymous, I just gave his name. Bizarre.
Last word to both of you.
Crucial thing to say about Congressman Istuk's approach is we have given it a fair shot. 100 years, $1 trillion, hundreds of thousands of people have died. At the end of all that, we can't even keep drugs out of our prisons. This model can never work. There are alternatives that have been tried that do work. And I just want to say one very quick thing. When he talks about compassion for families, this is a man who was in favour of putting the mothers and fathers of those families in prison. Don't believe it.
Hold on. Ernest Istuk, last word.
You're lying. You are lying when you say that I'm trying to put casual drug users in
Are you in
prison.
favour of putting drug
Okay.
addicts in
I'm
prison?
making clear the people that go to prison are the dealers.
Look it
And
up.
when you
Anyone
talk
can
about
look
the
this
cost
up.
of the
That
war
is
on drugs, don't
factually
give me
untrue.
a 100-year figure.
You're
Give
saying
me
there are
an
no
annual
drug
figure.
users or addicts in
Allow him
America.
to make his point, Johan. You made your point. Let me make his point.
Approximately 40. The annual figure from the federal government is approximately $35–40 billion, of which 40% is on treatment. So the cost of the war on drugs is not what you make it out to be. So don't tie together 100 years worth of numbers and throw them out and make it sound like that's what we spend every year. It's not true.
Ernest Istook, Johan Hari, thanks for joining me both. We're out of time. Appreciate you being here in the arena. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.